Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine this. You have a mind so brilliant it can cut through almost any argument, but you're caught in this impossible trap. Your conscience, this voice inside you, screams that God is real, absolutely real. And yet, when you look out at the world, at history, at people, it looks completely terrifyingly godless.
It's a profound conflict.
And that's what we're diving into today. The story of a man who was publicly called a liar, a deceiver. And his response wasn't a lawsuit. It was to strip his own soul bare for the world to see. We're looking at a text that makes this, frankly, frightening claim that there is no logical standing ground between absolute atheism and authoritarian Catholicism.
That's right. We are unpacking John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua.
And it is a profound work.
Mhm.
But you're right to start there with that tension, because while this is, technically an autobiography, we're not just looking at a life story today.
No, not at all. We are looking at a philosophical battlefield. Newman is arguing that the human intellect, our reason, if you just let it run wild, it naturally sprints towards atheism. It's a corrosive force.
That's a wild idea.
It is. And he believes the only thing that can stop that slide is an infallible external authority. It's a heavy, fascinating argument about how faith can even survive in a skeptical world.
So let's unpack this, because this entire book, which is, it's hundreds of pages of really dense history and theology, it all started because of a beef, a really public, really nasty squabble.
It really did. The catalyst seems almost trivial when you look back, but it sparked one of the greatest spiritual autobiographies ever written in English. And it all began with a man named Mr. Charles Kingsley.
Right, and Kingsley wasn't just some nobody. He was a big deal at the time, a popular writer, a clergyman, and he was sort of the face of what they called muscular Christianity.
Exactly. Think a robust, manly, straightforward English Protestantism. Very suspicious of anything too subtle, too complex, or frankly too foreign-looking, which is how he saw Catholicism.
What did he say? What was the actual accusation?
Well, Kingsley wrote a review in a magazine, and in it, he made this sweeping statement. He essentially accused Newman, and by extension, all Roman Catholic priests, of being fundamentally dishonest.
Wow.
The line was, "Truth for its own sake had never been a virtue with the Roman clergy." He basically said that Newman, who had famously converted from the Church of England to Catholicism, was a man who used cunning, who used sleight-of-hand logic, that he didn't care about truth, only about winning arguments for his church.
That's more than just an insult. That's an attack on his entire character, his entire life's work.
It strikes at the very core. It wasn't just you told a lie. The accusation was that Newman's whole intellectual system was a performance, a deception, that he was a snake, someone who twists words to trick simple, honest Englishmen.
So how does Newman respond? My first instinct would be to just write back, "No, you're the liar," or sue for libel.
And he knew that wouldn't work. He realized he was in a trap. Think about it. If someone accuses you of being a clever, manipulative arguer, what happens when you make a clever argument to defend yourself?
You just prove their point.
Exactly. Kingsley would just turn around and say, "See? Look how cunning he is. He's doing it again." So a logical defense was useless.
So what did he do?
Something radical. He realized he couldn't just show his logic. He had to show his living intelligence. He decided the only way out was to write a complete history of his mind.
The whole thing.
The whole thing, decades of his life, to show the step-by-step, painful, sincere evolution of his religious opinions. He had to prove he wasn't a knave or a fool, but a man following a path of conviction, even when it cost him everything. He had to show the process.
He had that great phrase for it, solus cum solo.
Alone with the alone, yes.
Mm-hmm.
He decided to write as if he were standing before God himself, revealing his most intimate thoughts. And that's why this matters so much. It stopped being a petty squabble, became this clash of worldviews. Kingsley's common-sense Protestantism versus Newman's complex, cytological journey of faith.
And to win, Newman had to explain how a man with his massive intellect could look at the modern world and choose to submit to an ancient absolute authority.
Which brings us right back to that central paradox we started with. This is the real philosophical core of the book, and it's where the whole atheism question just explodes onto the page.
It really does. Newman describes this huge conflict between what he feels inside and what he sees when he looks outside.
Let's start with the inside. He says he is as certain of God's existence as he is of his own. It's not an argument for him, it's a fact. He puts it beautifully. Two and two, only supreme and luminously self-evident beings, myself and my creator.
It sounds so simple and clear.
Yeah.
Like he's got it all figured out. I exist, God exists, end of story. But then he opens his eyes.
And that's where the horror begins. This is so crucial to his whole argument. He doesn't dismiss the atheist's view of the world. In a way, he validates it completely. He looks at human history, at society, at the immense suffering, the confusion, the way evil seems to win so often. And what does he see?
Nothing. No reflection of that creator he feels in his conscience.
Zero. I have the quote right here because you're right, it's just shockingly bleak for a man who would become a cardinal. He says, "The world seems to be nothing else than the prophet's scroll, full of lamentations and mourning and woe."
And he says explicitly that if he didn't have that internal voice of conscience, just looking at the world would make him an atheist or a pantheist immediately.
It's an absolutely stunning admission. He's saying the empirical evidence, the data you collect just by looking around, it does not point to a good and loving God. It points to chaos or nothingness.
He has that metaphor about the boy, which is just devastating.
Oh, it's so powerful. He says, imagine you see a boy who is clearly of a noble nature. He's intelligent, he's refined, he's built for great things, but you find him cast out on the streets without parents, no home, living in filth and misery. What would you conclude?
You wouldn't think, oh, he must have been created to live like this.
Of course not. You would immediately assume some terrible aboriginal calamity had occurred. A shipwreck, a revolution, a kidnapping. Something awful happened to separate him from his true origin.
And that terrible aboriginal calamity is his term for original sin.
Precisely. But he's framing it not as a Bible story you have to believe. He's framing it as the only logical explanation for the data. The world is so out of joint, it's so disconnected from the God his conscience guarantees, that the only way to reconcile the two is to assume the human race is implicated in some massive, ancient catastrophe.
So the logic is, my conscience says God is real. My eyes say the world is a godless mess. Therefore, the link between us and God must have been violently broken.
It's the only bridge that holds. For Newman, if you don't accept that calamity, that fall, you're forced into an impossible choice. You either have to reject your conscience and become a materialist atheist, or you have to reject the plain evidence of the world and become, delusional.
And this leads him to a really, really dark place when it comes to the human mind itself. I think this part is fascinating for anyone who values reason and critical thinking. He doesn't see the intellect as this pure, noble tool for finding truth.
Not in this fallen world, no. He calls it a universal solvent.
Like an acid.
Exactly, like a powerful acid that dissolves things. Newman argues that the wild living intellect of man, when it operates out here in the real world, is an aggressive, corrosive energy. It eats away at truth. It eats away at certainty. It eats away at faith.
Wait, so he's actually saying that if you just sit and think hard enough without any external guide, you won't find God. You'll actually reason your way out of belief in God.
That is exactly his thesis. He believes the natural tendency of the unaided human mind is toward unbelief. He looks at history, philosophy, politics, and he sees this constant drift. The intellect's job is to ask why and how and prove it. And it just keeps asking until there's nothing left. No truth, he says, however sacred, can stand against it in the long run.
That is such a stark image. The mind isn't a candle in the dark. It's a weapon that eventually turns on its owner.
He sees it as this wild, powerful energy that has to be tamed or it becomes self-destructive. And right there, that's the setup for the second half of his argument. That's the why of his conversion. Because if the world is a wreck and my own brain is an acid that's dissolving the floor beneath me,
you're in deep, deep trouble. You're drifting into an abyss of meaninglessness.
You are. And that's where the necessity of infallibility comes in. This is the pivot of the entire book. It's the solution to the problem he just laid out.
Okay, so he sets up this hypothesis. Let's walk through it.
Yeah.
He says, okay, assume there is a creator and assume he wants to have a religion on earth.
Right. And if he looks down and sees this anarchic world and he sees that our minds have this suicidal tendency.
Suicidal excesses is his phrase, which is just wow.
It is. He genuinely believes the intellect will kill its own foundations if left alone. So if God is going to intervene in this mess, it's highly probable, Newman says, that he would provide some kind of mechanism to stand up against that all-corroding, all-dissolving skepticism of the intellect.
The breakwater.
The breakwater. That's the key metaphor. He says the infallibility of the church isn't a burden. It's not a tyranny meant to suppress thought. It's a provision. It's a massive concrete wall built to stop the flood of unbelief from washing everything away.
I love that image. The ocean is this relentless force of skepticism and atheism, just pounding and pounding against the shore, and the church isn't a prison built on the land.
It's the seawall that preserves the land itself. It completely reframes the argument. For Kingsley, for most Protestants, for most modern secular people, an infallible church looks like a jail for the mind. It's someone telling you what to think.
But for Newman, it's a rescue boat.
It's a rescue. He's saying the intellect has to be saved from its own suicidal excesses. In this chaotic world, he needs an external authority to plant a flag and say, stop here, this is true. Otherwise, the acid just eats through everything.
So, in his view, this whole modern idea of being spiritual but not religious, or being a liberal Christian who picks and chooses, that's not a stable position.
Not at all. He argues that what he calls liberalism in religion, the idea that truth is just subjective opinion, that your sincere belief is as good as mine, is just a halfway house. It's a rest stop on the highway to atheism.
Because that universal solvent, your own reason, will just keep dissolving things. If I can decide the virgin birth is a metaphor, why not the resurrection?
Precisely. And if the resurrection, then why the incarnation? And if not the incarnation, then what are we even talking about? Newman argues that a perfectly consistent mind has to eventually choose. It's either atheism or Catholicity.
There's no logical middle ground.
He sees no stable logical middle ground. If you trust your own reason in this fallen world to be the final arbiter of all things, you will eventually reason your way to atheism. If you trust that God exists and has revealed himself, you must trust that he provided a concrete, authoritative way to preserve that revelation. For him, that's the Catholic Church. Everything in between is just a temporary, unstable compromise that will eventually collapse under the pressure of the intellect.
The Pope or atheism. That is one heck of a choice. But the irony is, Newman himself spent decades trying to build that middle ground.
He did. And that's the real tragedy and the drama of his early life. The story of the via media.
The middle way. We should probably explain what he was trying to do.
Of course. For years, Newman was a leading priest in the Church of England, a fellow at Oxford. He loved the Anglican Church, but he saw it being eroded by this very liberalism he came to fear. So he and his friends launched a movement to build a theological fortress.
Their goal was to prove that Anglicanism wasn't just some watered-down Protestantism.
Exactly. They wanted to show it was the true heir of the early undivided Christian church. The church of antiquity. The church of the fathers.
So it was a kind of Goldilocks theory. Rome is too superstitious, too authoritarian. That's too hot.
Right. And mainstream Protestantism is too fragmented, too rationalistic. That's too cold.
But Anglicanism, based on the ancient church, is just right.
That was the idea. He poured his genius into it. He went back to the writers of the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, trying to build this massive intellectual case that you could be deeply Catholic in your theology without submitting to the Pope.
But later on, he called it a paper religion.
He did, because at the time, he truly believed in it. He thought he had found the path. And then he looked at history, and history turned into a mirror. And he didn't like what he saw.
This is the famous monophysite moment. It's a bit of a technical deep dive, but it's the moment his whole world just shattered.
It is. So Newman is doing this deep study of the 5th century, and he's looking at a specific heresy called monophysitism.
Which was a debate about the nature of Christ, right?
Yes, but for Newman, the specifics of the theology weren't what scared him. It was the politics, the map of the situation.
Right.
In the 5th century, you had the Pope in Rome standing firm on tradition and authority. You had the extreme heretics, the monophysites, breaking away completely. Wow. And then you had a third group.
A middle party.
A middle party. The semi-Arians. They were the moderates. They tried to find compromise language. They were supported by the state, by the emperor. They thought Rome was too extreme and the heretics were too extreme. They saw themselves as the sensible center.
And Newman looks at this map from the 5th century, and he realizes,
oh my God, I'm not playing the part of the ancient Orthodox fathers. I'm playing the part of the compromisers, the heretics. He saw that his via media, the Anglican Church, looked exactly like that state-supported compromising middle party that history had condemned.
Well, the Church of Rome then looked just like the Church of Rome now, authoritative, demanding, and ultimately correct.
It was a gut punch. He has this famous line, I saw my face in that mirror and I was a monophysite. Can you imagine? To realize you're the bad guy in the story you've been reading your whole life.
He calls it seeing a ghost, a shadow of a hand upon the wall.
Yes. And he says, he who has seen a ghost cannot be as if he had never seen it. You can't unsee it. That one historical insight killed his entire theory. He realized the via media was an intellectual construct. It was just an idea on paper. But Rome, for better or worse, was a real, existing historical fact that acted the same way in the 5th century as it did in the 19th. His middle way was a dead end.
So his own intellect, his own historical research is dragging him towards Rome, even as every prejudice in his English heart is fighting against it. But there's another huge obstacle, and it's an obstacle for so many people. Miracles.
A massive one. Segment 5. For Kingsley and the average Victorian Protestant, all the Catholic stories about saints' relics healing people or statues weeping, it was just medieval, superstitious nonsense. They laughed at it.
And Newman's way of tackling this is fascinating. He doesn't try to prove each miracle. He talks about first principles.
Right. He says the reason a Protestant and a Catholic can look at the exact same story and come to opposite conclusions isn't about the evidence. It's about the fundamental assumption you bring to the table before you even hear the story.
The Protestant first principle, as he lays it out, is basically miracles happened in the Bible to get the church started, and then God stopped doing them. The age of miracles is over.
Exactly. So if you're a Protestant and you hear a report of a miracle in modern-day Italy, what's your default setting?
Fraud. It has to be a trick, because miracles don't happen anymore.
It's a perfectly logical deduction from that first principle, but the Catholic first principle is totally different.
Their assumption is God started doing miracles, he's still God. Why would he stop?
Newman's analogy is so simple and brilliant. He says, if a beggar gets food at a gentleman's house once, does he not send others thither?
That makes perfect sense. If you know the homeowner is generous, you'd expect them to keep being generous. You don't assume they locked the door and threw away the key after the first time.
And then Newman connects it back to the big one, the ultimate miracle that Christians already believe. The incarnation. The idea that the infinite creator of the universe became a helpless human baby in a manger.
If you can believe that, everything else is small potatoes.
That's his point exactly. He says if you can swallow the camel of the incarnation, it is completely illogical to strain at the gnat of a saint's relic having healing power. He suggests that this Protestant common sense that picks apart modern miracles, it won't stop there. If you apply that same rationalism consistently, it will eventually unravel the resurrection and the incarnation itself.
It's the universal solvent again. Once you start dissolving the supernatural with that acid of pure reason, you can't control where it stops.
You can't. He has another great analogy for this about Alfred's jewel.
Oh, right. Can you explain that? It really clicked for me how we treat secular history differently.
It's a brilliant point. He says, look, there's a jewel in a museum in Oxford that tradition says belonged to King Alfred the Great. Now, can we prove that with 100% certainty? No. There's no DNA test, no receipt. It's a strong probability based on tradition.
And we basically accept it. We treat it with what he calls historical charity.
We do. We don't scream fraud, liar at the museum curator. We say, well, it's very likely it's a venerable tradition, so we'll accept it. But when it comes to a religious relic, say a splinter of the true cross, what's the immediate reaction?
Outrage. How dare you? It's obviously a fake.
Right. And Newman just asks, why the different standard? Why don't we afford religious traditions the same charity we give to secular ones? He says it reveals a deep-seated a priori bias against the supernatural. The question isn't, is this true, but why are you so desperate for it to be false?
Okay, so we've covered the huge theological journey, the view of the world, the need for authority, the logic of miracles. But we have to circle back to where this all started, the personal accusation, the lying.
The charge that Newman and his church simply don't value truth.
To defend this, Newman introduces a concept called the economy, which, to our ears, sounds like it's about money.
It has nothing to do with money. It's a theological term from the early church fathers, from the Greek word oikonomia, which means household management or stewardship. And in this context, it meant managing the presentation of truth according to the capacity of the listener.
So like how you explain to a 5-year-old where babies come from, you don't give them the detailed biology lecture.
Exactly. Give them a simplified version they can handle. Mommy has a baby in her tummy. Is that the whole complete scientific truth? No. Is it a lie? Also, no. It's an accommodation to the listener's understanding. It's pedagogy.
He uses the example of drawing angels with wings.
A perfect example. Do angels, which are pure spirits, actually have feathered wings? Almost certainly not. But the image conveys the truth of their role. Swift messengers of God, in a way our human minds can grasp. That's economy. It's not lying.
But Kingsley was accusing him of something more sinister, equivocation, deliberately misleading people.
And on this, Newman has to tread very carefully. He admits that Catholic moral theology, what's known as casuistry,
Which is like applied ethics, right?
yeah,
Looking at specific messy cases.
exactly. It's not just don't steal, it's what if your family is starving? Can you steal a loaf of bread? And in this area, Newman admits that casuistry does allow for evasion in certain extreme circumstances.
The classic example being the murderer at the door.
The murderer at the door. A man with an axe asks you, "Is my intended victim hiding in your house?" You know they are. What do? Do you say, "Yes, he's in the basement because I must always tell the literal truth"?
Of course not. You lie to save a life.
And Newman's killer point is, everyone says that. He then quotes beloved Protestant heroes John Milton, Samuel Johnson, William Paley. They all agree that in extreme cases, to save a life or protect a nation, an untruth is permissible.
So his defense is basically, why are you singling me out for a moral conclusion that your own greatest thinkers also reached?
Precisely. He's showing it's not some sneaky Catholic invention. It's a universal moral dilemma. He distinguishes between the general rule of truth, which is absolute, and these rare, terrible moments where duties conflict. He argues the Catholic Church hates untruth, but it's not naive. It recognizes the complexity of living in a fallen world.
It's not that lying is good. It's that sometimes the world forces an awful choice on you.
And he also stresses that often the best course is just silence, don't answer. But if you're forced to, the duty to protect an innocent life overrides the duty of verbal accuracy to a would-be murderer.
Okay, so that brings us to the end, the final state of his mind. After all this, the history, the philosophy, the personal attacks, where does he land on the idea of certainty? So many people feel like if they have questions, it means they don't really have faith.
And this is maybe the most pastoral and comforting part of the entire book. Newman makes this absolutely crucial distinction between having difficulties and having doubt.
10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt.
That's the famous quote. He says he can have all sorts of intellectual problems. He can admit that he doesn't fully understand the physics of transubstantiation. He can struggle to reconcile a difficult passage in the Old Testament. Those are difficulties. They're puzzles.
But they don't shake the foundation of his belief.
Not at all. His analogy is so good, he says it's like a difficult math problem. You can stare at a complex equation and be completely baffled. You might fail to solve it, but your failure doesn't make you doubt that a solution exists. It doesn't make you doubt the laws of mathematics themselves.
That's really helpful. It means you can be confused without being an unbeliever.
Yes. You can be stumped by the how while remaining completely certain of the that. And for Newman, where does that certainty in the that come from? It comes from the authority. Because he trusts the church as God's oracle. He trusts that an answer to his difficulty exists, even if his own limited mind can't grasp it right now.
Which brings it all full circle, back to that ultimate choice he presents.
It all ties together. He looks at the world, at this wild, living intellect that's driving society toward what he calls a bottomless liberalism of thought. He sees it all drifting into a fog where nothing is true, everything is opinion, and eventually, God himself just evaporates.
And in the face of that, he sees the church as the only thing strong enough to stand against that tide.
That is his final conclusion. It is the breakwater. It's the rock. He submits his intellect to it, not because he hates reason, but because he believes it's the only way to save his faith in God from being dissolved by his own reason.
It's an incredible, powerful, and for many people, a very challenging argument. Let's try to synthesize this for everyone. We started with a man accused of being a liar and a deceiver.
A knave and a hypocrite.
And his response is to take us on this unbelievably intimate tour of his own mind. He admits the world looks godless. He admits the human intellect is dangerous. He admits history is messy.
And from all that chaos, he builds his case. Because the world is a mess and because our minds are a corrosive acid, we are in desperate need of a divine intervention that is concrete, visible, and authoritative. We need an infallible church.
The real aha moment for me in all this is realizing that Newman isn't an enemy of reason. He's a champion of faith who believes that reason, in our fallen world, is often the enemy of faith unless it's guided and protected.
That's it perfectly. Reason is a wild animal. It's beautiful and powerful, but if you don't put a fence around it, it will eventually turn around and eat you. For him, the church is that fence.
Which leaves us with a really provocative final thought to chew on. Newman lays out this stark choice, atheism or Catholicism. He suggests that what we call modern liberalism, the idea that you can just pick and choose your own truth, that one religion is as good as another, isn't a stable, sustainable position.
He asks, is it actually a destination? Or is it just a slow-motion slide into the abyss? And his question for you, for all of us, is this. If you reject the authority that claims to preserve the definition of God,
Yeah.
do you, over time, inevitably lose the God you were trying to redefine for yourself?
A vivid question to think
It's a
about.
very heavy question.
Thanks for thinking deeper with us.